786 people in March 2022, but it still does not go far enough to place the rights and protections of those who are working at sea on a parity to the rights and protections of those that are working in shore-based roles and with shore-based employment contracts. More still needs to be done, and more can still be done that will allow for greater protections for those that work at sea to be delivered, that's fully within the remit of this Parliament to be able to legislate for.
Okay, yeah, from my point of view, I don't think there'll be unintended consequences. I hope the intended consequences go far enough, but maybe we'll have to have more legislation going through. We had lots of legislation against the unions under previous government, and so hopefully we can get more legislation in favour of workers and their organisations. It doesn't go far enough, I don't think, but we can improve it, I think, during this process. One of the things we'd like to see is the power for trade unions to get redress, injunctive power against people like P&O, which was never considered. We were told that if we took action against P&O, and there was a slim possibility of it, we could be liable for all of their revenue loss every day of their trading, which could have been up to £15 to £20 million a day. So that's impossible for workers and their organisations to take forward. And what you've got to remember about P&O is they deliberately broke the law to get rid of their workforce and to undermine good shipping companies. So we've got an employer such as P&O and Irish Ferries working out of our ports that undermine good businesses. And I think I just caught the end of the previous session, where it was hoped that there'd be a lifting of all boats, to use that pun, but to create a playing field that is fairer. It will never be completely level, I don't think, but it would be fairer on all the good businesses in Britain that are working, British businesses and working in Britain, to make the pirates, what we consider P&O to be, come up to the standards of everyone else that's doing business here. Treat their workers well, treat the environment well, treat their passengers well. If you're doing all of those things, you will run a successful business despite a marginal increase in overhead. And let's not forget that people like P&O are dramatically resourced by the richest people on the globe. And they deliberately took that step to exploit our laws, as poor as they were, left to us by previous governments, because they knew they'd get away with it. And what they've got to be aware of in the future is they will not get away with it without consequences for their business and for their reputation. Unfortunately, the previous government has allowed them to shed their skin, leave it behind, along with all those people they made unemployed, and carry on as if nothing has happened. And that's a shame on all of those people that allowed them to do that.
Do you have any views on the trade union facility time provisions of this bill?
Not particularly. We make arrangements of our employers. We have private sector employers and public sector employers. We do that through collective agreements, and I imagine that we will always create decent arrangements with all of our employers, whether they're road transport, rail or maritime, about appropriate release for our people. So that's not a thing that concerns us overly at this time.
That's great.
No particular concerns in relation to the way facility time seems to be structured in that. I think it overall will prove to be beneficial. I know that there are some in the trade union movement that would like to see more on that. But again, I think with the sort of maritime aspect and the practicalities of working around that, it is helpful in terms of what is being proposed in the bill. Thank you.
And from your perspective?
No problem. From our perspective, we see both RMT and Nautilus Air as partners in our endeavours to do the right thing for our people, so full support.
Right.
Minister Justin Harris. Obviously, we were all horrified at the way people were treated by P&O, and I think we share your critique that the previous government's response to that was not sufficient. Clearly, we are trying to address those issues in the bill. Do you feel that this is going to be a good deterrent against employers basically calculating a financial issue as a way of trying to avoid their legal obligations on consultation?
Shall I go first?
Yep.
Well, I'm hoping it will be, Minister. I'm hoping that bad employers will have to think twice about being badder again in P&O's terms. And I've got to emphasise, we were on good terms with P&O. We were negotiating, both unions, their new vessels, and they deceived us deliberately, took legal advice that rather than negotiate with us the new technology vessels that were coming in, they'd rather sack all their people and break the law and use security guards to get our people out. So with good enforcement, with a powerful agency that knows what it's doing and has got a clear remit, and the right deterrence, and I think that goes into company law in some ways. I don't think any of those people were worried about being disbarred as directors, being fit or proper persons and all the rest of it. And I don't think they were worried about their profits being affected by any fine that they would get. As it happens, I don't think anything's happened to them at all. So as a director, you've got to think about whether I'm going to pay my VAT, whether I'm going to pass on the national insurance, whether I'm going to pay the rates and all the bills from my suppliers. You should be thinking about what the consequences for you are in employment law and other laws related to employment, and think very seriously if you're going to deter it. But we have got to have the power as trade unions, as representatives of the workers, to intervene where we know they're breaking the law. And that is a real shortcoming. The power is all with the employers. They can injunct me personally, they can injunct my trade union, they can close us down for making clerical errors on ballots, just misnaming or misbranding the grades in a dispute. And they will do it if they get any chance. We have no power to injunct them on behalf of our members, it seems. So I think that needs to be considered, that the Fair Work Agency and its enforcement powers should be at the level of injunction to stop these rogues getting away with it in the future.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I'd also add that what's quite helpful in terms of the bill is the removal of vessels being treated as individual establishments. That's particularly helpful when it comes to redundancy consultations. And indeed what we saw with previous case law, with previous legislation, with the case of Seahorse Maritime versus Nautilus International versus Seahorse Maritime, that was a particular case where it was proven that each individual vessel had to be treated as a single establishment, which removed the right for operators with significant GB links anyway in those particular circumstances, that being able to circumvent the need to consult with recognised trade unions on what amounted to mass redundancies. There were more than 20 people being made redundant from that particular employer, but they were able to circumvent that because each individual vessel was treated as a single establishment. Now, that is a real helpful feature of the Employment Rights Bill that's coming through, and something that I think should be celebrated and praised with that. That is going to be very helpful in us being able to defend our members' rights and hold companies to account for their responsibilities when going through redundancy process, we're going through collective consultation on business restructuring and organisations. Linking that to P&O ferries, it wouldn't have made a difference with that, as each of the P&O ferries establishments was more than 20, so there would have been a requirement for the collective consultation anyway, and indeed 2 out of the P&O ferries operations would have been more than 100 people, so it would have required slightly lengthier consultation periods under the legislation. But this is going to be helpful in wider maritime context for those where there are smaller numbers of seafarers engaged in actually being able to defend their rights and interests and really hold a company to account over the need for making those redundancies, as well as with the change to fire and rehire. That's quite helpful as well in terms of the support in businesses needing to demonstrate a clear and identifiable need instead of seemingly being able to operate on a whim.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that, and I think, talking about significant ties to the UK, this is really something that you have to keep in your mind, because it's very often in shipping that there's a myriad of different employers based outside of UK. For example, flag of the vessel can be, in many cases EU or UK, whatever. But I think when you look at the Straits of, the Dover Straits, we DFDS, yes, okay, we have UK flag, we also have French flag, but our vessels are doing 42 sailings a day in and out of Dover port every day, up to 54 then in the summertime. Other operators are doing more or less the same. If that's not a clear link to the UK, then I'd like to know what is. It's not the same as one sailing every day out of, a longer port in the North Sea. And I just think that my fear as a you know, an operator who, you know, hold our seafarers in good stead and as the absolute backbone of our organisation. And for me, I would like to be able to see that there's a way of capturing that in the UK law, and that we won't find yet another loophole of the flag state, you know, being responsible but doing nothing, and then the port state, in this case being UK, wanting to do something and not capable of doing it. That sounded like a bit of a riddle. I do apologise.
No, it's all very very useful. Thank you. Just something to pick up on something you said earlier, Mick, but others can answer as well if they want. You talked about injunctive relief as being a potential solution to dealing with the threat of fire and rehire. Obviously, we're consulting at the moment on measures, including interim relief, as a potential action that unions could take on behalf of the members. Could you just explain a little bit about why you would prefer injunctive relief as a solution rather than interim relief?
Well, interim relief, it can take time, and I'm not convinced that tribunals will have the power and have the kudos to achieve it. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, as you know, Minister, but what I want is the ability for the unions to make an intervention on behalf, and it'll have to be based on law and something that the company has done wrong. But it seems to me that injunctions are immediate and carry the weight of a higher court. When we get injuncted under the anti-trade union laws, it's at a high court and it's immediate, and there's no doubt about the effect of that injunction. If you want to defy it, it's on your head for your organisation, whether it's a trade union or a multinational company. So I do feel that if it's not called injunctive relief, I don't mind whatever way the bill comes out, as long as it's got the power of immediacy and enforceability through proper channels. That's what we want to see. We don't just want a slap on the wrist and then the company factors that in. You know, you've added another £10,000 to the fine, and if you're sacking 2,000 people, you don't really care. What we want is for them to be forced to stop the activity subject to the full force of the law, not just a minor blip on a spreadsheet. That's what we want to see. Whether it's called an injunction, interim relief, I don't mind. If the tribunals are beefed up so that they can do that, that's fine, because that can be a good channel as well. I'm open to suggestion on that, but I hope we get the power to do it.
Anyone else want to respond on that? Martin, yeah?
We've spoken about unintended consequences, but I think an intended consequence of this is about addressing an imbalance between the rights of employers and the rights of employees in the UK, the rights of workers. And as a trade union, we are subject to such higher bars and thresholds when it comes to being prevented from being able to enforce the rights of our members, being able to enforce the rights of workers in standing up for what is right and what is appropriate and what is fair. So to have a mechanism where an employer can be held to the same scrutiny in the same account and have the same preventative measure, that same preventative immediacy of that measure, without the consequences that we would have to face in terms of that, because employers don't face the consequences if that injunction is granted and it then turns out to be something that isn't fair or appropriate or is done on appeal. That's just dealt with. So I think it's about fairness, it's about it being appropriate, and it is right that unions can make interventions on behalf of the members that they represent and make those interventions without needing to worry about having to put significant amounts of members' money at risk, should that then turn out to be something that needs to be resolved at a later date. Unions tend not to pick those particular fights and arguments without having first looked very carefully at what is within the realms of the law and not. So it is a case of it would be extremely unusual that mechanism would be abused should it be granted. And I think it's really important that the intended consequences of placing the rights of workers and the rights of employers and trying to increase the rights of workers to a point at which they can actually address some of the imbalance in that is supported with this, and that would be a real big help in being able to defend the rights of workers.
Can I,
yes,
and I do agree with that, and I have to say that but the very nature of the thing is that employers and organisations are larger than employees, you know, and if the employees are not able to collect themselves to a sum total where their voices can be heard, then they have no chance. And there's something fundamentally wrong in this day and age that a union agreement can just be put to one side and actions taken, and just completely and utterly taking the voice away from your employees. And I just think when we look at how the United Kingdom operate on an international level, we're quite happy to sit with the unions and with employers together to negotiate at ILO level and at IMO level and all of this. But when we come home into our own shores, then no, those rules don't apply. So whatever, the unions are not the enemy to our organisation. And again, it's a really poor message that we're sending out, saying that, people who do the right thing, an organisation like DFDS, who recognise the employees' rights, but are actually disadvantaged, because before we sell a single ticket to a passenger, we are already hugely more costly than our operators in the same field. But we make the choice to start a race to the top instead of joining that race to the bottom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Liberal Democrat spokesperson Steve Darling.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And I'd like to just put a personal perspective. I feel that unfair employment laws can often fan the flames of tribalism, and I look at over the way at Europe, where there is a more consensual approach and more a collaborative culture. How do you see this bill could drive a more collaborative culture with employers and unions?
Well, if it makes us come to the table and people feel, and some employer groups even feel that they're not exempted from collective arrangements, that will be better. I mean, some people won't like this, but in the 70s we had 82% of workforce covered by collective bargaining. It's now 20%. Now, and there's arguments about that, and I don't want to relive the last 40 or 50 years, but it's clearly too low. The ILO, the IMF, all sorts of bodies are saying that the lack of collective arrangements is forcing this race to the bottom. But it's not just workers that get pushed to the bottom, it's these businesses that get pushed to the bottom as well. And people are now bidding on contractual margins that are completely unrealistic. I hear it from some of the clients I go into. So when I'm talking about contract cleaners, contract caterers, all sorts of people, they know that the people that are bidding for the business cannot make a margin, even a reasonable margin, 2% maybe. You'd be hoping in a business you'd be getting 5 and 10 and maybe even better. But people are knowing that they're underbidding other people, because that's the poor state of employment law that we've got. But it's also because we haven't got sectoral collective bargaining. Now, we had the previous speakers here from the Engineering Employers Federations, they used to be called, used to run a massively collectively bargained sector in this industry. If we had that, I think we'd have better arrangements all round and people would not be allowed to go rogue. Now, I'm hoping there will be some provision for that in the law so that all employers will know whether I'm working on a construction site or on the high seas or running a window cleaning business or whatever I'm doing, I cannot go below a certain level, and there'll be no sweatshops in the future and there'll be no mass exploitation. And the trade unions must have a say in that. They must have a say even in non-union sites. And that's what we used to get. The big firms used to set the trend and the perspective of where an industry should be, and many smaller businesses voluntarily followed the union agreement. And they weren't just union agreements, they were industry agreements. And I think we have to get back to some idea of that the industry stands for this. But many of those employers' federations have broken up now. They don't even feel they need to speak to the trade unions. And in the future, I hope this bill brings a lot of voluntary recognition so that many workers, certainly more than 50%, are covered by collective arrangements in one form or another. And the EU wants 80%, by the way, for those of you that are still hankering after that. That's the new measure.
I believe it was the early 90s, the last time the National Maritime Board met, which used to undertake sectoral collective bargaining between the shipping industry and between the maritime trade unions, which would have then been both of our predecessor organisations, and the UK Chamber of Shipping, which would set an establishment of the rates of pay, which both unions would then take away to individual employers and build upon. The situation exists elsewhere in the world. In the Netherlands, my colleagues and my team are negotiating at the moment for the Merchant Navy agreement-wide that sits for the Merchant Navy equivalent in the Netherlands for commercial shipping. They're negotiating that as we speak. They're undertaking negotiations with ship owner representatives and them as representatives as the seafarers, and they are setting what that standard looks like in the Netherlands for the minimum increase, and then we work with other employers to build on that with what we can do. It sets the minimum standard. So for you know, the envisagement of what sits within this, sectoral collective bargaining is going to be key. And indeed, we see a start of that through the element of fair pay agreements as they're being coming through with that. But sectoral collective bargaining really is going to help deliver the biggest gains, the biggest partnership between unions, between employers, as it should work and as it does work in many instances in maritime. And it's going to be crucial for solving one of the biggest challenges that the UK faces at the moment, which is the productivity crisis. Actually working together to solve that is going to be done through not only sectoral collective bargaining, but through just talking about how industry works. Unions, the workforce, those in the industry, the experts in that industry, and should be setting that standard as to what it looks like and working together to improve that and to generate those productivity gains, because everybody benefits when the productivity increases. Workers have better pay, better conditions, employers, better profit, better operations, better certainty. It's win-win.
We operate in a number of countries that have sectoral agreements like this: France, Denmark, Netherlands. So again, it does set the the level playing field for all competitors, and that there's a rate of pay that's fair and that everybody else is paying, and then you can focus on just doing business.
Thank you. Is that it, Mr. Darling? Yeah. Annalise Midgley.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just going to refer once again to the most high-profile case that we've seen of fire and rehire in recent times when P&O unlawfully sacked 800 workers, many of whom were your members and were impacted by that. At this morning's evidence session, Matthew Percival from the CBI said that fire and rehire proposals in this bill risk making redundancy easier than negotiating contract changes. Do you agree?
No, I don't agree with that at all. I mean, defending fire and rehire, or fire and replace, is what P&O was. There's two versions of it. Is defending the immoral. Maybe the CBI knows a thing or two about immoral behaviour. I don't know, but I don't know why they would be standing up against that. We negotiate contract changes all of the time, and the great problem with P&O, they deceived us. They told us that they were going to negotiate change for new technology, new vessels, new ways of working. There probably would have been some job losses, I understand, and we would have dealt with that under normal process. They decided to sabotage that because it was quicker, and they wanted to get imported foreign labour onto those vessels at £4 and £5 an hour rather than a collective agreement. So I don't see good employers struggling with that. I don't see decent businesses struggling with negotiating contract changes, staffing level changes, new technology agreements, which we're all going to need right across business. And indeed, we will talk to the FDS about that, hopefully in the near future, and Stena and all the other good shipping companies. We're talking about it on the railway. Every trade unionist that will come in front of any of you will say, we're constantly negotiating change. At the end of the Second World War, my union had 500,000 members. The railway employed 1.2 million people. That has obviously changed. We had sectoral collective bargaining all through that, and most employers had never heard of fire and rehire. You can retool an economy inside collective arrangements. Our European partners have shown us that if you refit your economy based on consensus and change and looking after people that have to leave, you'll get a more successful business. If you just guillotine the whole process, your reputation is going to be in ruin. So I don't accept the CBI's position. They were probably against the Health and Safety at Work Act, the Sex Equality Act. All of these acts have brought impacts on business, and no doubt the Factories Act was a bit burdensome for the mill owners and the mining companies of this country. Everything is difficult for a business, but you've got to live inside the regulations in a democracy, and that's what it should be about.
I suppose to some extent it's the difference between doing what's easy and what's right. And, you know, it's disappointing that there is an attitude amongst some elements of business in this country that they are opting to do what is easy as opposed to doing what is right. Negotiating with trade unions is fairly straightforward. And indeed, P&O Ferries, using that example, in 2020, at the height of the COVID pandemic, we negotiated redundancies with P&O Ferries as they reduced their operations and went through that process. So short of Mr Hebblethwaite not wanting to get back round the table with us, because we did hold them to account over their business proposals in 2020, we did make sure that the redundancies they were making were absolutely necessary, were to right-size the business. We did feedback on all of their proposals, and we engaged very heavily in that process in 2020 when we went through 2 rounds of redundancies with that particular employer, to then have them say, we wouldn't have been able to engage with what they were proposing because they know what they were proposing was wrong, morally reprehensible. To wipe out a long-standing, collectively bargained workforce, offering quality jobs, employment, training opportunities in, you know, across many deprived coastal communities, jobs that are still, losses of jobs that are still being felt in Kingston upon Hull, still being felt in Birkenhead, still being felt in Liverpool, still being felt in Dover, those loss of jobs. For them to be able to say, actually, because what we were suggesting was so wrong, we just decided to push ahead and do it anyway, knowing that there would be limited repercussions for that, is to some extent why we're here talking about it, because it highlighted just how easy it was for business to make the wrong decisions. So to have the CBI not recognising that those easy options are what's putting us in this position where regulation is being needed and needed to be developed is, you know, it's shocking, it's abysmal, but unfortunately it's not that surprising. I disagree with what he said. I disagree that this would make it the preferred option to go through a redundancy, to go through fire and rehire, than to go through and engage with trade unions. Because negotiating with trade unions, we understand the business operations and we can help, and we have helped. Because the number of redundancy consultations that I've been engaged with employers in maritime, where we've been able to look at things differently, where we've been able to support what it is that they're going through, where we've been able to talk about the number of redundancies that are potentially being needed to be made and support building jobs back in, support plans for growth, support changes to terms and conditions that's protected jobs, negotiated our way through that for the betterment of the business and the people that it employs, is countless at this point. So for the CBI to have that approach, for some business elements to have that approach, that it's easier to fire and rehire, it's easier to put that through instead of negotiating, it's really short-sighted and really problematic for the future.
So I'm going to try and get 3 more members in 5 minutes, but would you like to respond to that?
Jobs either exist or they don't. It's very black and white for me. I have to be quite honest with you, you know. So for me, fire and rehire is always a bit of a horror story, and particularly when you look long term and the skills and the intelligence that the people have on your operation and how to work. So for me, there's always another solution. So that would be my point of view.
Thank you. Chris Law.
Focusing still on fire and rehire, and just listening to the comments made in the last 5 minutes, I think it's consensus is we want to see the end of fire and rehire, and I completely support that. However, when you look at the detail of the bill, there could well be a loophole within this, so let it continue. There is a section which says that there is an exception for those in financial difficulties, and I wondered what your thoughts were on that. For example, who defines what the financial difficulties are, and who decides around that, and how that's to be negotiated? Because for me, using the term financial difficulty is actually a loophole for any employer to say, well, actually, we're going to have to let go in this circumstance. Do you agree with that, or do you think more work needs to be done on it?
I think we have to be very careful. Because companies are very good at creating entities that are subsidiaries of subsidiaries that are based in other jurisdictions and all sorts of measures that are far too complicated for a simple soul like me. I'd like the reporting of a business to be very straightforward. Everyone will know whether a business is failing. And fire and rehire for a failing business is not going to work in many instances. Certainly on shoreside, it's likely that the business will fold before such measures can be brought. And of course, it's very difficult to do what P&O did, because it relies on bringing people from overseas to replace. I mean, Grant Shapps said last year, or the year before, that he was going to replace all the railway workers in Britain at one stage. So there was actually a government minister promoting fire and rehire during our dispute. So I think we've got to be very careful not to allow loopholes. I know that accountants and auditors are very good at creating these loopholes, but as far